how are you?
Good, how are you?
We're hanging in there day by day.
You know,
Right.
that's all we can do.
We
Like get out a little bit more now that New York's like starting to phase out a reopening, or is it more everybody's kind of still trapped inside?
No, it's kind of scary. So like my partner and I have been really good and very diligent about it. So we've been at home most of the time and only going out for like short walks, and always wearing masks and gloves and everything. But since the soft reopening a week ago, everything looks normal, which is insane. It's just all over the place. Like in terms of social interaction, actual social interaction, we had one socially distant picnic with a couple of friends. I'm having my second one today with Claire Chase, with my friend Claire, and but like we're gonna be a few feet away from one another. But when I walk in the park, they're just people playing frisbee and being stupid. So the second wave is definitely coming, and then people are going to be all surprised. They're going to be like, who knew science, So it's all great news, and it's like when I look here and then I look at my home country, it's all amazing news. It's funny because my partner is from New Zealand, and they just eradicated it.
Yeah.
Like it's completely gone there. So it's a study in contrasts.
Well, that actually leads me right to my first question that I wanted to ask. I'm sure you've gotten this pretty often, but would you say your heritage has affected your music in any way?
I think that everybody's heritages affect everybody's music, right? It's impossible to do music without being you. How that manifests itself, of course, is very different from case to case. But in my case specifically, living most of my life now in a foreign country, in the United States, I think that exacerbated in me the sort of look inward, realizing that people look at you in those different lenses, and dealing with this whole transcultural and polycultural aspect of being a foreign artist in another country makes one reflect much more deeply on those cases. The pitfall, of course, is to fall too much for a fetishization of otherness, right? I'm not here to be anybody's Brazilian. I'm not here to be, the expected role of a Brazilian through the lenses of non-Brazilians, especially when we take into consideration, power structures. So I'm very attuned to my heritage, but I am attuned to it in a non-performative way.
I like that.
There's an interesting there's just sort of a conversation that I've had with some composers about this idea of a rite of passage of living in another country for an extended period of time, of just that development of being a foreigner, of being a separate entity, and trying to sort of work about those cultural differences in an interior sense that sort of lends itself well to composition. It's just striking to hear you say sort of a similar thing, right? This idea of being in a foreign country and having lived this second.
Yeah, but at the same time, I'm at a point now, I'm 46, and I've lived in the US since I was, 19, 20. So most of my life has been here. So when I think of home now, this is home. I don't feel too much of an outsider, although sometimes I'm reminded that I am. But this is my adulthood, and lots of what I consider cultural references for me now are American cultural references as well. Mm-hmm. So finding those connections, and yet, trying to somehow hold true to who I am and where I come from, becomes a sort of a lifelong, I wouldn't say challenge, but a lifelong exercise that I try to pay as close attention to as possible.
Yeah, I'm sure the cultural aspect of your home country versus what US has been experiencing for the past 20 something years is definitely been two different entities that affects like your writing, the way you think about like culture. But
I mean, more or less, because in many ways, Brazil and the US in the past 20 years have mirrored themselves quite a lot. I mean, even if you look at the political climate right now in the United States and you compare that to the political climate in Brazil, it's pretty much, the same. It's just different characters, let's just say that. And, American culture is everywhere. Is American culture is very pervasive, and I think it's even more so if you grow up in a large city, if you grow up in a cosmopolitan environment. And I grew up in Rio de Janeiro, which is a really cosmopolitan. So when I think of my youth, like of course that there were many things that were intrinsically Brazilian, within my upbringing. But I was also listening to, The Cure and eating Big Macs. And, like there was not this sort of disconnect. It was just a foreign country. It wasn't a foreign planet. That's what I'm trying to say,
I mean, we're both having that coronavirus, like similar trend going on right now.
We're going for number one in Brazil now. The US is still number one, but we're getting close, yeah. Not for lack of trying from the government.
Do the two countries have like, since like United States is experiencing like two crises at once, within the whole health crisis and like the whole social crisis, does Brazil have anything like it in terms of like discrimination?
Oh, gosh. I mean, so Brazil was the very last country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery. It did not happen until 1888. Brazil has received more than 10 times the number of African slaves than the ones that came to the United States. So the history of Brazil and Blackness is perhaps even more complicated than the history of Blackness in the United States. And when we look at police brutality, I think that the total number of fatalities that are related to police brutality in the United States last year was around 15 or 1600, which is quite a lot. In Brazil, it was 5,800. And out of that number, 80% of the victims were Black. So, the problem in Brazil is not only similar, it's much more exacerbated. Now, what both countries have in common is that this is not a new problem, and people conflate what is in the news with what is new. This is, a centuries-long problem. So, like when people talk about this coexistence of, COVID-19 with racism, I'm like, no, wait. COVID-19 is new. This is a new event. Prejudice, and racial inequality and the horrible situation, that, Black people were subjugated both in Brazil and the United States have been going on for a long, long time. If people are jumping in right now and treating this as topical, that's just insanity. It's insane. And what I hope is that those two things are not going to be conflated forever, and treated as a fad. Because if you think of it, I mean, George Floyd's death was horrible, but he wasn't even the first person, to be recorded saying, "I can't breathe," being killed by police officers. Eric Garner was the first one. So we have to keep that in mind, that what we are experiencing right now, even though it comes across as zeitgeisty, the idea that it is in the zeitgeist is in itself outrageous.
It is absurd that like it is taking us this long to finally be at least trying as like a collective to like fix something that's so old, that's been going on since centuries.
Yeah.
But like, a lot of the trends that we've been seeing is like our art world, the classical music world, is like we're actually starting to like see at least attempts of reform and trying to be more inclusive of people of color, programming more.
Are we?
That's what I'm trying to. That's what Are we?
We're seeing a lot of PR. We're seeing a lot of thoughts and prayers. We're seeing a lot of we stand in solidarity, you know, but the reality is if people want to fix any of this, they can fix it today. They can fix it right now. It takes zero time to fix those things. So
Exactly.
I don't buy into this idea that all of a sudden people are woke. I think that people are just afraid of being called racist. And that's very different than, you know, being ready to do something about things.
Right. So instead of like just saying that we stand in solidarity, which is clearly obviously not enough, what do you think would be the best course of action for like those big arts organizations that are like primarily, you know, owned by old white men that just don't, what can we be doing? What should we be doing in order to be more inclusive instead of just saying like, you know, posting a black square and saying that we stand in solidarity? What is a better example of how we could be more inclusive? And
they got to stand up to the money that they earn, right? I mean, the reality is a lot of people are afraid of doing the things that they know that they should be doing because of where their money is coming from, you know, because of the donor bases, especially the big institutions. And it is time to wash our hands from bad money. You know, I think that not doing the things that we need to do because we need to keep a certain amount of money in our bank account is just morally unacceptable. Of course, that it's you know it's a different game altogether between big institutions and large institutions. But when I look at big institutions that are doing that without even needing to, you know, they're just doing that so they don't have to touch their endowments, rather than actually using the money to fix situations in very concrete ways, that's when I get really upset. You know, they don't need to be racist. They chose to be racist because that's just more lucrative to them. And then, you know, when you look at smaller institutions, the reasons for them to not program music by Black artists is even less known, right? Because we cannot even use the usual quality apology that is given, because quality is very, very high among Black musicians, both performers and composers, you know. So that argument is also null. You know, when I look at the music being done by Black artists in the United States and worldwide, it is extremely high. So the problem really is where the money comes from, and in a certain way also the way in which we see things, which is very connected to education. You know, and when we think of the formation of musicians, you know, and especially its link to academia, you know, and when we look at curriculum on how music is taught and how our metrics then of quality are defined by those things, the systemic racism that we're all taught and absorb, you know, as musicians, that is what is going on, and that is what is being perpetuated. But all of those things are constructs.
So this is something that I have had a lot of conversations with my buddies in the contemporary music scene, right? Is that for like somehow we've managed in the whole like non-institutional mindset to hold to the Eurocentric institution. Like it's just out of one institution and into another. And there's so many critiques of the institutions that commission Black artists for, you know, works about the experience of being Black in America, or like works about Black trauma, or equating it to jazz.
Yes,
Like
performing trauma for me. Yes.
There is more to being Black than those experiences, and we should not be asking them to define their music by it.
Well, you know, I mean, in a lot of ways, abstraction is almost a white privilege these days. Mm-hmm. Every time that the microphone ends on a person of color's hands, you're expected to perform your trauma for the audience. You know, like people will put you on that frame. Like, I cannot write a piece about butterflies. I have to write a piece about being queer or Black or Latin, you know, otherwise, you know, it's not interesting for for presenters. And I particularly push back, you know, on that. You know, I will talk about whatever part of my identity if I choose to. I'm not going to do that, you know, on demand. You know, I'm not going to cry on demand for the audience. That said, though, I also think that for me, and this is, I can only speak for myself here, being a voice for, those facets in my life is important because, even though I do believe that the white allies have to do a lot of the heavy work, and they have to do it on their own, I do believe that I can offer a few perspectives that are unique. So when I choose to engage with these aspects of my being, I do so, and I choose to do it quite often because I understand that the lack of representation of people who look like me, in the circles that I frequent is still, very stark.
I mean, like, I don't even know how to respond to that because, like, yeah, you're right. Like,
well, I mean, it's not really a matter. The thing is, I think that everybody's very afraid right now of dealing with those things. It is very uncomfortable to deal with those things, especially as a white person. I can sympathize, and I can see how scary it is, because nobody wants to be called racist, right? But the problem with the denial of the title, the denial of the nomenclature, is that once you declare yourself not racist, you stop this self-reflection. You stop thinking of how you are part of a system that is rigged, and what is your personal responsibilities within it. There is a wonderful book that I've been just giving left and right to all of my white friends called White Fragility by Robbie D'Angelo. I don't know how many of you here have read the book. I highly recommend it. And the wonderful thing about D'Angelo's book is that she identifies as the most problematic group of racists, white liberals. People who very quickly say, I am not racist. I am all for diversity. I'm all for inclusion, because that conviction that you are, exempt from it makes you blind to the things that you actually do and the things that you actually embody. And so if we pass that, if we pass this sort of I'm not this, therefore I don't have to address that. And I mean, I'm also thinking that it doesn't suffice not being racist, right? One has to be anti-racist. But once you actually pass that initial fear of engaging with it, in a very concrete way, then you are facing your inability to talk about those things. You don't have the vocabulary, you don't have the experience to do that. So a lot of the things that you want to do or say may come across as sloppy, as unintentionally offensive, and you start to just contract in your fear. And I think that there are two stages there that people should be open to experience and embrace. First, stop thinking that you have to act right off the bat. Listen, like pay attention to what is being said, reflect on what is being said, like internalize things. And when you listen, listen to the voices that are being oppressed. Like it just makes more sense to actually look for that perspective that one has been lacking, because again, I am all for white allyship, but I'm not, for white soapboxes, in which, the white folks are going to dominate the discussion on how Black people are oppressed. That doesn't suffice. That is not enough, and that is not even fair. It's like, white folks have had 400 years to say whatever they wanted to say. It is time to pass the microphone. And then, on hearing these other voices, think of how one can interact with them and start from there, knowing that, now and then you're going to put your foot in your mouth and you're going to do things that are not great, but that heuristic approach, forgiving oneself a little bit for the flaws, but not too much, because, this process is very overdue, Therefore, there needs to be some kind of speeding up and catching up in there, just puts one in a much better and much more courageous mind frame, in my opinion.
Yeah, and that's the other, like, talking about not just that white liberals are are dangerous. The other one that I've heard a lot is that, and I say this as within the community, right, that white liberal gay males are really dangerous because they'll often say, well, I understand what it's like to be discriminated.
I mean, it's a very dangerous game sometimes to make equivalences of minorities, right? I mean, I particularly hate the term minority because when you say minority, you make people invisible, and when you say minority, you tend to actually think much more in terms of what are the most accepted minorities, and there's a gradation there. I've been part of a lot of panels that deal with, Black issues, racial issues, and then issues of sexual identity. And I can tell you, as a Black Latin queer composer, looking at my little trifecta here, that the one element that suffers the greatest amount of discrimination is the Blackness. Like when you put it all on a scale, and I mean, and of course that if I look at works by queer, Black female artists, I'm like, more power to you, because that is actually let's make the trifecta even more potent here. Queer Black trans artists, those are the ones that I want to be their allies, and I want to shut up about my needs, and I want to pay attention to what they actually need. But the reality also is when we talk about gay man, like we're talking about man, and when we talk about gay man's culture as it came to be understood in the mainstream right now, we're talking about white gay men. And with the whiteness and with the maleness comes so much that tarnish what being queer is about, that it becomes almost unavoidable for what is being presented to the outside world to not be highly corrupted and sometimes very insensitive towards other underrepresented groups.
And there's an element of gatekeeping that goes on as well at least in our field, right, where we have so many barriers of entry with academia and access to literature and access to teachers, that like we are so complicit in keeping Black trans female artists whose voices we're not hearing and we need to be hearing out of our system because of those barriers.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, gatekeeping is the number one problem, for all of this. I mean, we can talk about gatekeeping in academia, but we should also talk about gatekeeping in the judicial system. I mean, we can expand this conversation, outside of just purely, artistic aesthetics, and I think that like a lot of the problems that we have within discussion of artistic aesthetics is racial. It is about the inequalities, when it comes to race and gender and sexual orientation and identity as a whole. Like we are a microcosm of everything else. Like what happens within the arts is not, a phenomenon that just sort of came out of nowhere and infiltrated in arts. And then what can we do about this gatekeeping? Well, we can go for its roots, right? And again, I think that education plays a huge role. As long as we don't question curriculum in schools and universities, as long as we don't look at what is being taught, how it's being taught, and by whom it's being taught, and to whom it's being taught, we are going to continue to promote this lock, in the gate. A very concrete example, it's that last week was, the 75th birthday of Anthony Braxton, who, in my opinion, is one of the greatest American composers ever. You know, if you ask me to name like the 3 top American composers, you know, within what we call, you know, art music or whatever this is, you know, I will definitely put Anthony Braxton in that list. And all that we've talked about, all that the big institutions have talked about is Beethoven. You know, let's talk about Beethoven's birthday because, you know, Beethoven needs PR, you know. So underrepresented and so underplayed that we need so many Beethoven festivals, y'all. And it's just, you know, it's just so blatantly prejudiced and so much about that gatekeeping. It's so clearly rigged that I don't even understand how people have the decency to put a Beethoven festival forth.
If I hear another 250th birthday celebration concert, if I hear that word ever again, I'm just gonna start yelling.
You know, I mean, I gotta say, I love Beethoven. You know, do I think that Beethoven is the ultimate genius? Heck no. You know, and I was just talking to, I was talking to Nadia Sirota on her show about the myth of the genius, right? And how this figures come to become genius. And first of all, this idea of like the canon being made of masters who are perfect is completely baloney, right? What we think of Beethoven nowadays is what has survived of Beethoven. But Beethoven wrote some horrible, really janky pieces that, you know, thank goodness, you know, within, you know, time they were forgotten. You know, they were purposely forgotten. So what we get of Beethoven today is already a curated Beethoven, right? It's the super Beethoven that never existed, that didn't write one wrong note. Then, of course, is the fact that if you start looking at history, you see a lot of amazing composers that, you know, lived during Beethoven's time that just did not get as much attention as Beethoven did, you know, and because some historians and some, you know, publishers and critics, you know, decided that Beethoven was the one who was going to survive, he then becomes the metric. And once we elect someone to be the metrics, they cannot be wrong, right? I mean, it's just obvious to go for the genius label because they are the A plus of that, you know, rubric that you have created, you know, but the rubric was created. The rubric is not a thing. In Hegelian ways of looking at what that rubric is, it only exists in itself.
The other birthday that's coming up in October is the 80th birthday of Julius Eastman. And right, we're seeing all these Beethoven festivals, but no one's doing an 80th birthday celebration for Julius Eastman.
Well, speak for yourself. I was just speaking this morning with my friend Seth Parker Woods, and I was actually looking at the score of The Holy Presence of Joan of Arc, and thinking of how can I program it and what can we do, and thinking also of how I can include more Eastman on my curriculum for next year. So I'm doing it, and I know that Seth has been doing that forever now. There's so much good Eastman stuff out there that hasn't even been performed in ages, you know, or when it's performed, you know, it's a rare occasion. But I'm a huge Julius Eastman fan.
I'm curious, you know, we talk about, of course, gatekeeping and the role of academia here and of education. I mean, as a teacher, you sort of have that privilege to affect those changes. How is teaching affected your writing as well in the last couple of years?
Well, let me start by saying I wish I had more power.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in reality, when we talk about shared governance, you know, like the pillars of academia, you are kind of bound to consensus sometimes, you know, and the red tape is so thick that sometimes even changing one course or creating another course can take 2-3 years to go from committee to committee until things are approved. But you know, I mean, I've also have had amazingly supportive colleagues that have helped pushing things forward, you know, more and more, but still lots needs to be done. But you know, when you think of like what a school can do, you know, like I'm gonna talk like bureaucrat stuff now and admin stuff now, but say that you are, you know, a faculty member at an institution that is accredited by NASM, accredited by NASM, the National Association of Schools of Music. NASM has a rubric of what a curriculum should look like that has very clear ways in which you have to structure your curriculum in order for your degree to be, acceptable. So anything that deviates from what NASM, has dictated as the structure may compromise your accreditation as an institution. So of course that there is even like an outside, overseeing force that is already telling you, you can only go this far with what you do. That said, when I think of what I do as a composition teacher, that is where I perhaps can be a little more effective, in many ways. First of all, on the students that I teach, when I look at my students who have done amazing things in the past, 3 years, what I am very, very glad is that the absolute minority of them are white, and none of them are white male, or not to the full extent of the term, if I should say so. The way in which I approach composition is highly individualistic, which I think that in itself is not Eurocentric. One of the most important things for me on talking to my students is to talk about what they don't like. I am not interested in honing prejudices, in working on style, in that, way of looking at style, because I do believe that style is a consequence and it should never be a cause. When we talk about repertoire and they talk about things that they don't like, what I find more and more is that at the end of the discussion, that I don't like it becomes I don't know it. And once they actually know more about things, the disdain for the things that were at first seen as negative tends to subside. And that affects me as well. I mean, my students will bring things that I don't know or know very little about. So it's an exchange of information and an exchange of perspective that has definitely made me a better artist.
Just picking your brain a little bit, is there one or two particular artists, pieces, performers that you've been introduced to in the last couple of years by your students that you said, I wish I had found that first?
So in terms of like European composers, younger European composers, I got into the Clara Ionota. I mean, I'm a rap rat. So I feel like I'm on top of things most of the time, but Clara Ionota was one that by the time that I looked at it more seriously, she was already kind of like everywhere in Europe. And that was because of a student of mine who was like a Ionota head, So yeah, Cat Lamb will be another example of someone that, maybe up until like 4 years ago, I had heard like one Cat Lamb piece here, or one or two things here and there. But I had a student who was a little more attuned to Cat Lamb's work, and that made me look at Cat Lamb's pieces in greater depth, which then took me to Mark Sabat, who I have not, I had not spent as much time as I should. So yeah.
It's awesome.
Yeah, we have Cat Lamb later in the series, so we're gonna be really excited to talk to her. Actually,
love Cat Lamb.
Yeah, that'll be fun. Her ears are amazing. Like the way she hears the world.
And just the way that she thinks of music, I love, when we talk about Cat Lamb, we talk about tuning and we talk about like sensations. But what I really, really love about the way that she talks about her music is the spiritual side of the discussion, the sort of humanistic side of everything that she's doing. Yeah.
You have some of that in your music too. This, like, when you talk about this energy that you have that sort of plays into your music. It's a very human, like almost visceral energy.
Yeah, I mean, that's just me in general, like I'm just hyper and in your face. So I think that gets in the music. But yeah, I mean, music is about humanity, right? I mean, music is very, very human in many ways. You know, I mean, when I think of like composition, composition is a collaborative endeavor, right? Like nobody composes alone. You don't compose for the ether. You know, you need things to compose that go outside of you as a human being. So I think that composing is living within the world in itself. And I think of like when I think of like the composers that I admire and the music that I connect with is music that does exactly that, that connects. And then looking at how those connections happen, it's always from a human and humanistic, if not humanitarian perspective.
I'm glad you mentioned Claire Chase earlier and like Nadia Sirota, which were two people I was actually going to like ask you about because they're actually two icons that like we love and like see just about everywhere. I just want to know like how did you all meet? Like your best collaborations, your best moments with people that make such a difference.
Those are like two of my dearest friends, right? I mean, Claire, I say that Claire is my sister from another mister. You know, we like she's my bestie. You know, she is besides being a fantastic musician, and like an amazing artist. If I have a problem, a personal problem, I'll talk through with Claire. Like that's the kind of relationship that we have. I met Claire in 2002 or three, when I got in Chicago, which was just a few months before she got in Chicago and started ICE. And yeah, like a friend of mine, another composer, introduced me to her because this friend was putting together an application for this festival, June in Buffalo, and had written like this insanely difficult piece for flute. And then she was telling me, oh, I found this crazy flutist who plays everything and it's amazing. And then she took me to a bar where she was hanging out with Claire. And I remember that we ended up like just talking for like 6 hours straight, and being like, oh, you are my soulmate, and then making music together was just sort of like a consequence of it. And with Nadia, it's not that different of a story. I met Nadia when we were both students, and we ended up at Tanglewood together as fellows. And Nadia was one of the people that I connected with the most, and we spent a whole summer together. And then ever since, we're really close friends, like I love the fact that, when people talk about my music specifically, they talk about Nadia, they talk about Claire, they talk about Ryan, Muncie, because all of those people are my peeps. Like if I throw a little get together in my house, those are the people who I will invite. Like those are the people who actually come and like break bread with me. Making music with people that you break bread with is very, very different than making music with people that you don't know that well. Like one can actually go completely different and enhanced degree of depth in one's artistic pursuit when you're pursuing them with people that get you. They just get you and you get them. Like I can close my eyes and I can hear Nadia's tone and I can see how her body moves. So as I'm writing, I am sculpting it for her, which makes my viola music be completely different than if I were writing for an invisible artist.
This is something that I have to presume Josh learned from you, but he and I were having a conversation once and he said, I don't like people I don't know playing my music because they don't know my sense of humor.
And Josh's sense of humor is very particular.
Yes. Very particular to his music too.
Yes. And actually, when I was talking about Clariano, the student that I was thinking of was Josh. We think differently then, because I do think that once the music comes out, and once like that premiere, has happened, I don't even care where it ends. Like it took me forever to grow up. you know, to become an adult in that sense. You know, it took me forever to like get a manager, to sign with a publisher. It took me forever to even register my music, which was so shameful. Like I had both BMI and ASCAP like calling me every year being like, you've lost I don't know how much money because those things are not registered, you know, and I still like if it's unpublished, you know, if people contact me for works, I just give it away. You know, it's like, and want to play it. You know, it's fine. I am not here to curate my legacy. I find that kind of exercise extremely vain. You know, I'm just writing music, and what happens with the music afterwards, I don't know slash care.
I love that, and I love that like that openness of writing music, not just for like for academia or for legacy, but just for people to connect with, for people to share in that space of music making. I love that.
Yeah, and that space is so fluid, right? You know, I mean, I've had so many conversations with folks about like eclecticism. Like I get asked that a lot. It's like, your music is so eclectic. When I hear this, it sounds very different than that you did. And oh, and you work with this group of people, and then you work with this band, and then you work with, you know, this artist. And how do you do that? And I'm like, I'm just I'm chilling with people. You know, like it would be insane for me to write for Deerhoof the same way that I would write for, you know, the LA Phil. Like I would be not a very nice person if I, you know, were not engaging with people in that, you know, with that degree of interpersonality, of like bouncing ideas from one another. You know, if I thought that the bouncing of ideas between, you know, A and myself and Z and myself are producing everything, I find that that is sort of sociopathic, you know? Yeah. Like, of course, that my music will reflect who I'm doing music with. And I happen to like to talk to people from all kinds of proclivities and backgrounds because I think that that enriches me as a human being.
So, and just thinking of like future projects and the application of that, we talked to Du Yun about this, about her fanfare project.
Mm-hmm.
And I was curious.
Oh yeah, I'm doing that.
Yeah,
I'm doing that.
How's it going?
It's really interesting because I didn't know the performer beforehand. And so when I got the commission, I was like, I gotta find out who this person is. And we started talking on Facebook chat, and then we had, you know, some meetings, and little by little, you know, now I know Michael a little bit better. And like I asked him to be part of the project. I was like, hey, why don't you come up with like a setup that makes sense to you? You know, we talked about, you know, what I was thinking for the concept of the piece. And then he started talking about this very important mentor of his that had just recently passed away. You know, besides being a prominent percussionist, he was also a triangle maker, a very specific kind of triangle. I was like, that's
Alinéa, yep.
You know, yes.
Mm-hmm.
So let's incorporate all of this in the way in which we create this music, you know. So we are developing our personal relationship, which is informing me so much of what kind of music we should be creating together, and that's the only way that I can work.
I'm sorry, who is this performer? I'm the percussionist here. I'm just curious.
Oh, it's Michael from the Cincinnati Symphony.
Oh, okay. Yeah. That's great. Very cool.
He's awesome.
I'm from Cincinnati, and my parents play in the symphony, so.
Oh, awesome! Yeah,
they know each other.
I'm so happy that Nate Backhober is there now, because Nate is, you know, a wonderful mind and someone who is really always thinking, you know, literally outside the box. You know, first with the LA Feel and now with Cincinnati. So there's some other fun things to come.
Yeah, I'm excited to see as these younger minds start taking like artistic roles with large orchestras. I'm excited to start to see the shift in projects, the shift in commissions, and what hopefully that will bring about you, case in point.
Yeah, no, I'm really excited. I mean, you know, now that Matthias is gonna be the new I forgot the title, but like curator, you know, I think that even more interesting things can be brought about. Yeah,
Well, Marcos, this has been awesome.
great, such a pleasure talking to you folks, and you know, thanks for creating this space, and I can't wait to see what y'all put together.
Thanks for being like a part of this space.
Oh, please, my pleasure, anytime.
Thank you so much.
Thank you again. Yeah.
Most welcome, best of luck, and hope to see you all in real life very soon.
Yes.
We do as well.
Talk to you
Yes.
soon.
You as well. Nice to meet you.
Take care.
Thanks so much for tuning into this week's episode of Everything But the Kitchen Sinks. We hope you enjoyed it.
If you'd like to hear more, you can find all the episodes of our summer series on our YouTube channel and our website, alineaensemble.org.
Also, be sure to check out our social media profiles for more information and previews of upcoming episodes. Our handle is Alinéa Ensemble.
Please feel free to share today's episode with anybody you think might like it, and don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions or comments.
Stay tuned for more episodes of Everything But the Kitchen Sink, released every Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time.
And as always, we hope you are all safe and well. See you next time.
I mean, I'll show you. This is my desk. And that is only half of my desk.